Hello, you're listening to the Citizen Truth podcast. We're excited today to speak with Mr. Ray McGovern about the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Ray served as a CIA analyst for 27 years, from the JFK administration to the George H.W. Bush administration. Ray chaired the National Intelligence Estimates, was the chief of the CIA's Soviet Analyst Division, prepared the president's daily brief under Presidents Reagan and H.W. Bush, and later co-founded the activist group Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. So thanks a lot for speaking with us today.
Most welcome, Peter.
Yeah. So I listened to your recent discussion with John Mearsheimer, Jack Matlock, and others, which I highly recommend to listeners, as it gives a thorough contextual background to the current crisis that is commonly omitted from Western narratives, including NATO expansion and the importance of the 2014 Maidan coup. Something that you spoke about, Ray, that stuck out to me that I wanted to touch on was the Chinese dimension to what's going on right now, or the potential of Chinese tacit approval for recent actions by Russia and Chinese-Russian cooperation and its major geopolitical ramifications. So could you speak a bit about those developments?
Sure. Peter, I would mention to your listeners, viewers, that session from a week ago, arranged by the Committee for the Republic, has now gotten a last count of 550,000 views. Given the fact that it lasted an hour and 40 minutes, that's
yeah, it's impressive.
Unusual. And we're gratified by that because there's so little out there that speaks truth to people who need to know what the truth is. I'm very fond of the acronym that I manufactured about 4 years ago. It was kind of approved and complemented by the likes of Stephen Cohen, the late Stephen Cohen, professor of Russian studies, and Pepe Escobar, who's one of my favorite realist reporters. And it's the Mickey map. And I would encourage your viewers to get out a pencil if they still have pencils these days. And write it down. It's the Mickey Mouse. It rhymes sort of with Mickey Mouse, okay? So you can remember it easy. Mickey Mouse. MICIMATT, military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. In other words, the old MIC, the old military industrial complex of which Eisenhower warned us. Now, sort of a footnote here, Eisenhower said that this was a real danger to our democracy. He got that right, okay? He also said that the only antidote was a fully informed citizenry. We got that. And that's why when I say Mickey Matt, and I spell out media as if all caps, the media is the fulcrum. It's the cornerstone. Without the media, the whole enterprise doesn't work. It can't brainwash all our fellow citizens. So I wanted to mention that because that's what's at the bottom of all of this. And that's the only way to explain why it was that when Russia fell apart, when I should say the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, fell apart back in 1990, 1991, I had just left the CIA as primarily a Russian analyst. I had a lot of jobs, but that was my expertise. I've been studying Russia for, believe it or not, 6 decades, ever since I decided to major in Russia Russian in college. So I was feeling really good about the whole thing. Berlin Wall had fallen, and George H.W. Bush, whom I worked for in the 70s when he was at CIA as the director, and whom I briefed regularly under Ronald Reagan, he made the very enlightened statement that he wanted to see a Europe complete and free from Lisbon to Vladivostok on the Pacific. Okay, he called up Gorbachev. Let me tell you a little vignette here. I say Gorbachev. Okay, now why do I say Gorbachev? It's because that's the way Mrs. Gorbachev says it, all right? Now, people say, well, that's sort of like, it's putting it on. Well, no, you ought to be able to pronounce people's names right, okay? I mean, Tony Blinken, he still says Ukraine. And he still says, I talked with Lavrov. Well, Tony, it's Lavrov and it's Ukraine. On one talk show, I tried to, in hopes that Tony was listening, I tried to give him a mnemonic, okay? Now, Tony, listen here. Listen to the accent, okay? Forget about the geography. You know enough that, okay, so here it is. The rain in Spain falls mainly in Ukraine. Can you say that, Tony? Ukraine. Okay, I'm a little off topic here, but the reason I mentioned Gorbachev was because I was briefing the Vice President, George H.W. Bush. And he says, Ray, you know Russian, used to teach it. How do I pronounce Gorbachev? I know that's correct, and not Gorbachev, and not right. I said, well, look, say garbage. Now say off. Okay, now say them together. Gorbachev. You got it. That's it. Now I could explain to you the orthography, why unaccented E, but I'm not going to do that. Just remember Gorbachev. And George H.W. Bush was the only one in Washington at high level that could pronounce it correctly for a while, and some of them never got it. Anyhow, George H.W. Bush was enlightened, okay? Not only did he want to know how to pronounce important names, but he had his head screwed on right. And he knew that Russia was finished. It fell apart. It had no army or anything. And so he said, let's have peace from Lisbon to Vladivostok, okay? He called up Gorbachev when the Berlin Wall fell in the middle of November 1989. And he said, look, Mikhail, sorry for your troubles. Look, be assured, I'm not going to dance on the Berlin Wall. I'm not going to take advantage of your troubles. Just good luck with them. And by the way, we ought to get together really soon. The place is falling apart, this Europe, so we ought to talk about it. How soon can you meet? A couple of weeks. But let's meet in Malta in 3 weeks. And they did. George H.W. Bush, president, Mikhail Gorbachev, head of the Soviet Union at that time, met. And again, Bush reassured him, Mikhail, I'm not going to take advantage of your situation. The United States respects what's happening here. We're sorry for your troubles. Now, let's see what we can work out. How soon could you see my Secretary of State? Because we don't have a lot of time to lose here. 6 weeks. The summit in Malta was the first week of December. First week of February, James Baker, the Secretary of State for George H.W. Bush, arrives at Moscow. Long story short, he says this to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, the foreign minister at the time. He says, now we got a deal for you, and it involves the reunification of Germany. And Gorbachev goes, you got to understand this, guys, all right? Gorbachev knew what had happened in World War II, as most Americans don't know. He knew that 26 million with an M, okay, Soviet citizens had died, had been killed during that war. He knew that the Americans hardly can appreciate this, not only because it's not taught in the schools, but also because America lost 400,000 plus soldiers, all soldiers. Now, 400,000 plus soldiers is a lot. I'm not diminishing that, but 26 million is a lot more. Now, those weren't all soldiers, of course, but they were Soviets. So here is Gorbachev told by Baker, look, we're going to make a deal. It involves reunification of Germany. Now, the whole purpose after World War II of NATO was to keep Russia out of Western Europe, to keep the US in Western Europe, and to keep the Germans divided. Okay, so here is Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. Here they are coming at this thing with the experience. We're talking 1990 now, not too long after World War II. At least they remember it, as I do. Okay, I was alive during those days, and they're being asked to accept the reunification of Germany. Did they want it? Of course not. Did McGovern want it? Of course not. I lived in Germany for 5 years. I could say a platitude like some of my best friends are Germans, and they are. But the reality is such. Having grown up during and right after the war, and having seen what happened in the previous century, I wanted the Germans to be divided forever. Okay, so doesn't matter what McGovern wanted. But Gorbachev and Shevardnadze said, "Well, that's a big quid you're saying here. What's the pro quo? What's the quo?" And Baker says, "Well, how about we agree that NATO will not move 1 inch, that's about 2+ centimeters, farther east toward Russia. How about we agree on that?" And Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, well, let's think about that. They go home, they go back to the Kremlin, and they think about that. And they look at the economic disarray. They expect a lot of help from the US. And they come back and mirabile dictu, wonder of wonders, they say, well, not 1 inch, not 1 inch. And say, well, okay. Now, the big mistake, of course, my father's a lawyer, right? He always says, Ray, get it in writing. Get it in writing. Whoa. Well, James Baker was a smart, slick lawyer from Texas, and he didn't offer it in writing. And to their detriment, this is why Gorbachev is so unpopular now in Russia. Despite all the things he did for the Russian people, he didn't get it. He didn't get that promise in writing. So what happened? Well, George H.W. Bush made good on that promise, but when he was succeeded by Bill Clinton, Clinton said, why not? Why don't we? Clinton said, well, I'm running against Bob Dole. Those key Midwestern countries, those key Midwestern states, okay, have lots of Czechs and Polacks, lots of Romanians and Bulgarians. Why don't we let them into NATO? And he had been told, well, we promised not to do that. He said, well, show it to me in writing. I'm a lawyer, show it to me in writing, right? It wasn't written down. And so he thought he needed that last minute boost. And people like Jack Matlock, who was then ambassador to the Soviet Union, testified before congressional committees and said, this is a terrible mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake. Lots of other people warned it was a terrible mistake. And after, Jack tells the story, after he got finished testifying one of these committees, one of the congressmen came up and said, look, it's a gone. It's a done deal. Clinton thinks he needs the support of all the Poles and Czechs and Hungarians in the Midwestern states, and that's what's going to happen. So don't argue with it. So anyhow, that's what happened in the 90s, and Clinton was responsible for reneging on that promise. Now, I'll be a little quicker now because we're probably running out of time. What happens in 2002 with the little Bush, which is George W. Bush, comes into town, right? Now, there was a strategic equilibrium between Russia and the US existing at the time. We all had scads of offensive nuclear missiles and bombers and submarines, but we didn't have enough protection against them, namely anti-ballistic missile protection, to guarantee that any country could use those missiles and not suffer a crippling retaliatory attack. Okay, that was the whole purpose of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. I know this in a personal way because I headed a branch on Soviet foreign policy at CIA in the early 70s. And I seconded 3 of my best analysts to work with the SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks delegation, whether it was in Helsinki or whether it was in Vienna. I had one working with the military experts and CIA, and one reporting the results of the talks to our director and other mukadimooks, as my Irish grandmother would call them, other mukadimooks in Washington. I was there in May 1972 for the signing of that keystone, just key treaty, which, because of this balance of terror, ensured that neither country would really think of trying to make a first strike against the other country. Now, one achievement that CIA was able to provide to President Nixon, okay, was doveraj no proveraj. In other words, it didn't start with Reagan, this trust but verify business. It started with Nixon. And he said, and he and Kissinger asked us, look, if the Russians or the Soviets cheat on this, will you guys be able to find out? And we said, well, how much time would you give us? Well, 2 weeks. So we went back to the real experts, the techies who run the satellites and all that kind of stuff. And they said, yeah, we could do it in 2 weeks. Did we do it? Yes, we did. Did the Russians cheat? Yes, they did. Did we call them on it? We did. Did they destroy the extra radar? Yes, they did. In 1986, see, each side was restricted by that time to 1 anti-ballistic missile radar, 1, hardly enough to protect the country, right? We saw number 2 going up in a place called Krasnoyarsk in the middle of Siberia. It was a mammoth radar, and it could only be for this purpose. Our specialists verified that. So we took images of it, put it down on the table, called the Soviets in and said, look, tear that thing down. So this is before Reagan said, tear the Berlin Wall down. He said, tear that radar down. And there was, no, it's not right. No, well, it took 6 years. 6 years. We sat around the table, and finally the Russians said, all right, it's an ABM radar. We'll tear it down. And they did. Okay, there's a lesson in that. If you have if you have a way to verify these treaties, you can trust them, okay? And you need people like the CIA collection capability to ensure that we can trust, okay? So that was, we're talking now up to George W. Bush, 2002, he gets out of the ABM treaty. He leaves it, stops it. 3 decades of stability, of nuclear equilibrium, he gets out of it. And then Trump gets out of what we call the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, that was signed in 1987, and that was a miracle. It was a miracle that McGovern never expected. Let me explain. We built these intermediate range ballistic missiles. Why? Because we could. Because the Mickey Matt would make a lot of money building them, and we called them Pershing IIs. Did the Russians do the same thing? Yeah. They had something they called SS-20s. There were lots of them, several dozen, okay? They were already installed, they were already in place, they were ready to fire, okay? Now, what was the problem? The problem was that based in Europe, they could reach European capitals, Russian capitals, in about 10 minutes. Whereas before, with the ICBMs, well, it took at least 30 minutes. Would you like to have 10 minutes warning before you have to decide to destroy the rest of the world? Well, there were some wise people around in those days, and they said, this is ridiculous. Let's destroy these intermediate range ballistic missiles. They did. They destroyed this whole class of missiles already in place, okay? They had inspectors. One of my best friends, Scott Ritter, was one of the inspectors, went out there and watched the Soviets blow these things up, okay? So that is possible. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying that Trump got out of the INF treaty. So here are the Russians looking on and say, whoa, we don't have the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We don't have the INF treaty. What are these guys trying to do? Now, the Russian intelligence capability is quite good, especially in what they call their near abroad, in what we used to call Eastern Europe. And they watched ABM sites go up in Romania and Poland. And they said, what are you guys doing? I mean, okay, the ABM missile, you got a treaty, you got it. Well, why do you put these in Poland and Romania? And we said, oh, we have to defend Europe from the threat from Iran. North Korea, mostly Iran. Come on, So, I mean, if further proof of lying were needed, there was this deal worked out with Iran, which would preclude them from having any such capability for 10 years, right? And what happened to these ABM sites against Iran? They kept being in place. The ones in Romania are operational. The ones in Poland probably in a couple of months, okay? Now, what's the problem with these? The problem is that they're not primarily anti-ballistic missile emplacements. They can easily be configured with a switch or a couple of buttons to fire offensive missiles of the kind that Putin calls Tomahawk. The Russian doesn't have any H, okay? So these are the Tomahawk missiles, and worse, that can go into these emplacements. So he's made it very clear over the years, particularly since about 7 years ago, that he considers this a strategic threat, because if they're put in those ABM sites, they endanger part of Russia's retaliatory capability with their ICBMs and other forces in the European part of Russia. So that's what's behind all this stuff. NATO moving to the east and Ukraine a special case. Now, I'll talk a little bit about Ukraine. Let's start in 2008, okay? 2008, Putin had not yet rebuilt the Russian military. They still figured they couldn't do much against US threats. The US had won the war against Iraq in 91 and was feeling its oats. It didn't much care about losing wars in Iraq since. And so there was a lot of talk about bringing Ukraine and Georgia, the country Georgia in the Caucasus, into NATO. So what happens? February 1st, 2008. Now I have this information thanks to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks published the cable. Okay, February 1st, 2008, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, he was new at the time, he's still Russian foreign minister, he calls the US ambassador in Moscow in to the foreign ministry. Who's the US ambassador in Moscow? A fellow named William Burns. He's head of the CIA now, okay? Well, long story short, we have this from the cable that Bill Burns wrote back to Condoleezza Rice. I won't give any adjectives there, who was our Secretary of State. What he said was this: Lavrov asks me, Mr. Burns, do you know what "niet" means? I said, well, yeah, it means no. He says, "Niet" means "niet." If you bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, we will have to decide whether we have to intervene in Ukraine, which we don't want to do, but there's sure to be a civil war there. "Niet" means "niet," don't do it. So Bill Burns, to his credit, reports back to Rice in a very factual way. This is really important to the Russians. Be advised that they have strategic interest too. Okay, what happens? Well, that was February 1st, 2008. On April 3rd, 2008, NATO, at a summit in Bucharest, Romania, decided Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. In other words, Lavrov, Putin will do what we want to do, and they will become members of NATO. Now, there's a complicated plan whereby you need to satisfy some requirements to enter NATO. And the French and the Germans were dead set against Ukraine being in NATO. And so, it was never a serious thing. It was serious to the Russians to the point where this year they made the point that Ukraine's not going to be part of NATO. And besides that, we want to roll back some of the incursions that you have made despite your promise back in 1990. Now, I'll just finish with this, and we can talk more about it because it's the most important change in world history over the last couple of decades. When I took up my duties as a Russian analyst at CIA, it was early '94 that I was given a portfolio which included the dispute, the conflict between Russia and China. It was a growth industry. I mean, there was lots of evidence that this was real. We had troglodytes that said, I have been fooled. They're both communists. Well, we were able to prove it really well. It's a satellite photography. Would you believe 15 divisions? 15 highly equipped divisions on the Soviet side of the Chinese border. Would you believe firefights across their riverine borders? Would you believe all this stuff? Well, it became very clear to us that they hated each other. There was irredenta. The Chinese say we were cheated under unequal treaties going back to the 17th century. We were cheated out of 1.5 square thousand kilometers of Siberia. You got Siberia, used to be, it probably belongs to us. So there's all kinds of real conflict, not to mention their competition to become head of the what was then the world communist movement. So we were convinced, in a word, hey, these guys hate each other. They hate each other from another picture. They're going to hate each other forever. We were wrong. More enlightened leadership came in. Zhou Enlai on the Chinese side, Brezhnev, Kosygin on the Russian side, and then others. And they said, Khrushchev. So, well, this is not really good idea for either of us. The US is playing us off one against the other. Let's see if we can cooperate. And long story short, now we're going from the 60s, right, to the 2020s now. Last year, and this is what I'm astonished that people either don't know or just don't think is important. Last year, there was a summit. George, what's his name? What's his name? The new guy, Biden, Joe Biden. Joe Biden gets a little afraid of what's going on the Russian side of the Ukraine border, and he calls up Putin and said, let's have a summit. So they go to a summit. It happened in Geneva. The date was June 16. And the most startling thing we know came out of that summit was announced to us by Joe Biden himself. They're trying to hustle him on the plane to go home. No, he's talking to the press. He said, I don't like to divulge what I said to Putin. It wouldn't be appropriate, but Russia has a real bad problem with China. China is squeezing the Russians. They have this several 1,000-mile border, and Russia knows that China aspires not to be only the big economic power, but big military power. So we understand that Russia's got a real problem with China. Now, I would have loved to have been a fly on a wall there when when Putin turned to his advisor and says, this guy's reading from the history book from 5 decades ago? Who's telling him? Well, suffice it to say that far from being squeezed by China, they were becoming more and more partial to a fraternal embrace, right? Okay. And they set out after June of last year to show not only Biden, but the whole world how close their relationship is. I won't go into great detail, but they staged a summit which said our alliance, our strategic relationship exceeds in closeness and in effectiveness a traditional alliance. There's no upper end to this. We don't have any things that we can't discuss and agree on. Hello, that's what they tried to tell Biden, and that's what the reality is now. And fast forward to today, why did Putin feel his oats? Why, after being very circumspect up until June of last year, did he start making demands on NATO, saying you got to roll back this stuff, you got to adhere to your promises, right? Here's the treaty. We want you to sign this treaty and go back to the promises you made. What gave him that chutzpah? I'll tell you what. A fellow named Z, great big guy representing 1.4 billion with a B people. Okay. So I kept writing at the beginning of last year, that it looked like China and Russia were getting really, really close. And it looked like they had more than an alliance. Like they said, it wasn't just rhetoric, and that the US military would have to look at a two-front war if they were to try to engage Russia or China. That there was the effect, in essence, a military alliance. Now, I didn't know that Xi would give Putin the go-ahead to invade Ukraine. Not many of my Russian specialist friends knew that, nor did my Chinese specialist friends. Now, let me just talk about them. China has an inviolate, until now, basic principle: non-interference in other people's affairs. It's their core foreign policy theorem, right? So none of us expected, number one, that Putin would invade Ukraine. We thought he could get his objectives met in some other way. The West seemed to be showing more flexibility given his ultimata. Nor did we expect that Xi would agree to that. But when Putin met Xi for the opening of the Olympics on the 4th of March, 4th of February this year, that's when they said there's no upper limit to our friendship and our equivalent alliance. And that apparently is when Putin, in my view, checked with Xi and says, it's not only these cruise missile sites, we could handle that. It's these damn fascists. It's these damn neo-Nazis. They're killing a lot of our Russian-speaking people in the eastern Ukraine. They're in the government. We think we can get rid of them, but we're going to have to invade to do that. What do you think? No. Did Xi say, no, that's against our principles. No, don't ever do that. We stand firm behind non-interference in other people's affairs. Apparently he didn't say that. What he said was, can you wait until after the Olympics are over? God. So the Olympics are over on the 20th of February, right? Then Putin immediately recognized Lugansk and Donetsk, the two eastern oblasts or provinces of Ukraine. And on the 24th, he invaded. Now, most of the people who had been wrong about so much, like me, had said, oh, I wonder how the Chinese are going to react to this. Oh my God, that's their principle, And the Chinese supported Russia. It was amazing, surprised everyone. At the UN, elsewhere, the Chinese said, no deal. We're not going to go in with your sanctions or anything like that. We think sanctions are foolish. We think that Russian demands with respect to NATO are the right demands. And we hate fighting and we hate war, but we think you ought to listen to Putin. That's basically the Chinese stand, surprising everyone. So just to wrap this part up here, what we have here is, we used to have the triangular relationship here, China, Russia, and the US. And I might also add that the US ability to exploit their hostility 6 decades ago was part of the reason we could get the arms control treaty signed. The Russians were worried that the Chinese would steal a march on cultivating good relations with the United States. And that permitted clever guys like Nixon, in this rate when he was clever, Nixon and Kissinger, to exploit that. So that is no more. What you have now is not a triangle, but you have a sort of triangle, but It's an isosceles triangle, for those of you who remember your geometry, with two really long sides, right? And then a little bit of a side. And guess who the short end is? The United States. Now, I hope that our military is smart enough, it's more a hope than an expectation, that they will not want to get involved in a war against China and Russia. But you have some of our top military not only saying precisely that we should do that, but even countenancing the use of nuclear weapons. You know, SAC, the Strategic Air Command, it's called STRATCOM now. They have a Navy admiral in charge of that. His name is Thomas Richards. Okay, so Admiral Richards says, you know, we might have to use these small nuclear weapons. You know, it may come to that. You know, and then this little guy, what's his name, Stavridis. He's another admiral. He used to command NATO, and he's got this crazy voice. He says, "Well, we ought to. In 10 years, we'll be at nuclear war with China." I mean, hello? Don't these people get it? Well, Putin gets it. And thank goodness, so far, Biden is avoiding steps that are unnecessarily provocative. And one I would share with you is simply that he canceled one of these intercontinental ballistic missile tests. He canceled it. Why? Well, he canceled it because the Russians really can't be sure when we do one of these tests that it's not the real thing. And I'll finish on this note because it came through at our webinar last Wednesday. Ted Postal, who is a physics professor at MIT and who is the chief analyst and advisor to the chief of naval operations back in the day at the Pentagon, he points out that the Russian early warning system is not as good as ours. Ours, we can pinpoint not only the time, but the location of any ballistic missile set up at any point in the landmass of this planet Earth or the sea. The Russians can't do that. And this has been made clear in some near misses where the Russians were not sure that they were not under attack by our sea-launched ballistic missiles because their coverage of them is deficient up to nil. So put yourself in Putin's place. I mean, I think he really cares about defending his country. People don't get it. There's no ABM treaty now. There's no INF treaty now. You know, we're moving these cruise missiles and others up to the Russian border. He's got to depend on an insufficient early warning system. And yet he sees a little bit of restraint on the part of Biden. Biden doesn't want a nuclear war either. Let's hope that obtains. His military doesn't. Even the Mickey Mat. I mean, even the Mickey Mat probably wants everything right up to full war, but you know, they sell more arms that way, but they don't want nuclear war. So there's enough incentive on the part of people who have a brain to avoid it. Problem, of course, is an accident. The problem is a launch that the Russians misinterpret, or we misinterpret. So it's labil. The Germans say labil. It means really, really tentative, really, really itsy kitsy. All right, but it's not as bad as it could be. The only qualifier I add on that is that I was surprised when Putin raised the fact that, you know, we have nuclear missiles. That's not something that Russian presidents have done recently, least of all Putin. I guess that's just a mark of how exasperated or how defensive he feels, just that he had to warn the world that Russia is not on its back. in the final analysis, it can destroy the rest of us. Hell of a thing to say, but that was the implication. Sorry to talk for so long here, but Peter, I'd be happy to answer questions or address anything else you have.
Absolutely. No, I really appreciate it. That was a very interesting background. But yeah, one thing that I did want to ask you about that just sort of came to the surface yesterday was speaking of China and kind of their increasing boldness on the international stage was a spokesperson from the foreign ministry alluded to U.S. bioweapons after Victoria Nuland also yesterday spoke about fear that the Russians would take over U.S. biolabs in Ukraine and do something bad with those. So I just was wondering what your take on this bioweapon dimension is in Ukraine or biolaboratories.
When I heard that, U.S. bioweapon or biolaboratories in Ukraine? Huh? Well, Victoria Nuland, who is largely responsible for this whole mess, by the way, admitted it. Yeah, somebody said there were 30 of them or something like that, and she was afraid the Russians might take them over. Okay, so they're making vaccines to help avoid terrible diseases. Let them take it over, for God's sake. You know, what's the danger there? Oh, maybe they're making something else, huh? Maybe they're making anthrax, bubonic plague, other things that really don't help anybody. Now, I don't know that. I'm tired of saying it beggars belief, or I just can't understand, because there are a lot of things that beggared belief and that I couldn't understand that have happened now. Okay, but it's a legitimate question. What the hell are U.S. biological laboratories, 30 of them, if that's a correct figure, doing in Ukraine? And why is Victoria Nuland so afraid of them being detected and taken over by the Russians? I don't know the answer to that, but there's enough truth in the reality of these bioweapon or these biolaboratories to ask that question. And of course, the Russians are charging that those things are bioweapons laboratories. And, who's to believe during the war, or during any kind of war? Truth, as you know, Peter, is the first casualty of war. So it's it's hard to believe either side on that. The only thing we have in terms of substance is what Victoria Nuland has said, and that is disturbing enough in my view.
Yeah, it's something else I wanted to ask you about was your opinion of what degree of influence the oligarchs, the Russian oligarchs, have on Putin, or what that dynamic, especially now that sanctions are being put in place against them as a tool potentially. Especially when? Since sanctions are being threatened against various oligarchs in his circle. Yeah, if you think that's a factor, or
yeah. Well, Peter, I'm not an expert on Russian internal domestic politics. I know probably more than most, but my shtick is foreign policy. So with that caveat, I'd just say Putin, oligarchs, no doubt he couldn't eliminate them all. He did put the reins on many of them, chased a lot of them out of Russia. So I suspect he's still beholden to some of the oligarchs, but he's running the country. It's very clear that he's running it all by himself with his very close advisors, but he's in charge. Oligarchs, well, they operate at their own risk in Russia. I think there's more risk to oligarchs in Russia than there is risk to oligarchs right here in the good old US of A. We've got our own oligarchs, and the disparity between what the poor have at their disposal and what our oligarchs have is much more, well, is much more flagrant than that in Russia, in my view. Having said that, I'll say again that I'm not an expert. I think that oligarchs have their way of salting their money into various places, so they're never left penniless. And I love these photos of these big yachts that are said to be mysterious. Mysterious means belongs to a Russian oligarch, a friend of Putin. Give me a break. I don't know who these ships belong to, but it should be possible to find out, don't you think?
Yeah, and I guess just one last question would be your opinion of the Biden administration's strategic thinking here, or, there have been statements by Hillary Clinton and Adam Schiff and others to make Ukraine a similar situation to Afghanistan, or to, arm insurgents there and make it a drawn out affair. If you see that as what they're trying to do right there. And yeah.
Well, the head of the CIA right now is Bill Burns, the fellow that we mentioned before as ambassador to Russia. I would hope that he's a smart enough guy and old enough and has enough money in his IRA that if they asked him to run a insurgency or let his eager beaver operatives run an insurgency in Ukraine, that he would quit. It would be stupid. It would be simply sticking another stick in Russia's eye, because Russia can control what goes on in Ukraine. And with half the population on Russia's side, an insurgency is going to be really hard to do unless it's kept on the western side of the Dnieper River. And I don't think that Putin is going to go to the western side of the Dnieper. I think if he does, not only is he a little crazy, but he will have proved McGovern wrong once again.
Well, with that, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and sharing your insight and your decades of experience.
Most welcome, Peter.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Mm-hmm.